Hello and welcome to this presentation about the Privacy Act of 1988. The intended audience for this is VCE computing students in Units 1 and 2. Normally I would make a presentation for concepts that cover both Units 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, but the APPs, which are the Australian Privacy Principles, the specified ones are actually quite different. They're different enough, so they're in different presentations. So our learning intention today is that students can explain the general purpose of the Australian Privacy Act and of the four specified Australian privacy principles. First of all, let's talk about what the Act is. Well, it's an Act of the Australian Parliament. So, it was a bill that was posted, and now we can actually see it. So the Privacy Act of 1988, you can in fact see the entire Act. If you look here on the register there in fact is the entire Act. You can view the latest version, which incidentally was just updated about 6 months ago. It in fact appears to be number 119. Oh no, that's a piece of legislation, 119. But it appears that it was last updated. Includes amendments from 2024. So you could read the entire Act if you wanted to. It applies to federal government itself, its agencies, and some state and territory agencies, and it applies to many private sector organisations, not really small businesses, but lots of organisations. So, when we're looking at who it applies to in the government sector, the main people that it applies to is the federal government and its agencies. There are some state and territory organisations, but I've never seen it come up in the exam, so I wouldn't stress about that. If you're performing a public function, so you're basically acting on behalf of the federal government, you're going to be bound by the Act. In the private sector, if you're an organisation with an annual turnover of more than $3 million, that's the money that you're collecting and the money you're paying out, then you are bound by the Act. Now that's lots and lots of organisations. So you would probably expect most of the time that you are protected by the Act. Some small businesses, even if they have a turnover of less than that, and I just reiterate, that's not profit, that's turnover. If you're handling sensitive information, so if you're buying and selling personal data, that noise is just my greyhound in the background, by the way. If you're a healthcare provider, and if you're contracted by the government to do particular work, then you are also bound by the Act. There are a few exemptions. If you're a small business with a turnover of less than $3 million, by and large, you're exempt. Some charitable organisations, political parties, conveniently, media organisations in certain journalistic contexts. So if you've got a subscription to a newspaper, then you're protected by the Act. But there is some information that they don't have to follow the Act for in terms of their journalistic work. So there are 13 Australian privacy principles, and they're actually surprisingly easy to follow and understand. It's actually not all that hard to get your head around them. We're only interested in 4 for the purpose of Units 1 and 2. APP1 is the open and transparent management of personal information. APP2 is about anonymity and pseudonymity. I always struggle with that. APP is the use or disclosure of personal information when they can share your information with other parties. And 11 is how they do the security of your personal information. So let's start off with APP1. APP1 says that you must have a clearly expressed and up-to-date privacy policy. You can't just wash your hands of it and say, we don't believe in that sort of thing, or we're not doing anything interesting, there's nothing to see here. It's the price of doing business. If you've got a turnover of over $3 million, then you need to have a policy like this. It must be freely available. You can't say to people, trust us, we have a policy, you don't need to see it. People are allowed to see it, and it must be written such that your normal person can understand it. And you must take reasonable steps to implement the practices and comply with the APP, including letting people make inquiries and complaints. Again, you can't just say, no, sorry, not your problem. Anonymity and pseudonymity. Anonymity means they can interact with the organisation without providing any identifying information. You sometimes see kind of joke videos about this on the internet, as if you went into a shop and said, I'd like a loaf of bread, and they said, oh sure, give us your phone number and your credit card number and your email and how old you are and all of this stuff. But even for an online service, if they can deal with you anonymously, then you should let them. Pseudonymity means that they can use a made-up name if they want. So that's kind of the baseline, that you should be entitled to those things. Now, so you must give people an option to do this unless, and the unless things are pretty big, and this is why lots of places do make you prove who you are. Oh, actually, before I get to that, so you should be able to make an inquiry or a complaint without telling them who you are. You should be able to access services where possible without telling them who you are, and you should be able to provide feedback and participate in surveys and research. They're not required to do this when they're required to do it by law. So this law doesn't count when some other law says they have to find out who it is. Bank accounts, for instance, because they want to make sure people are paying their tax, they're not money laundering. Mobile phone accounts, they want to make, because, people use them for criminal and harassing activity, so you have to be able to trace it back to a person. I suspect web hosting, you probably need to know who's doing it. So where there's legislation saying, yeah, they get to ask who you are, and it's if you can't practically look after somebody without having some idea who they are, even if it's not their real name, then you're allowed to do it. So, for instance, I can't say, well, I want an email account, but I don't want to tell you what my username or password is. I just want you to magically know. No, they need to know who you are so that they can let you into your account. So there are quite a few instances where they're going to ask. Now, when can they share your secrets or your private information with other people? Well, first of all, they can only use it in the first instance for the purpose in which it was created. So when you sign up for 42 Penguins, which is my website, then I can only use it to maintain your account so that you can use the services on there. You haven't given me blanket approval to use that across the board. There are exceptions to this rule. If you've consented to secondary use or disclosure, you'd reasonably expect the secondary use or disclosure. So going forward, I think, to one of the questions, if I give an organisation my phone number and they're going to deliver something to me, then I'm not going to be surprised when the courier sends me a text on the phone number saying, hey, your parcel's going to arrive in the next hour. That's very closely related to the primary purpose that I gave them, or that I'm using them for. If it's authorised by law, of course they can disclose it. If there's a permitted general situation, such as preventing serious threats to life, health or safety, or if it's for law enforcement. Finally, it says use for research purposes and meet specific conditions. I would say, and my guess is, and obviously I'm not a lawyer, I would say you probably, for most cases, need to specify that it's going to be used for research. So the final one that we're interested in as Unit 1 and 2 students is the security of personal information, which is APP 11. So they must provide appropriate security measures based on the sensitivity of the information, the amount and type of personal information, and the possible consequences if a security breach occurs. So, you've seen some quite spectacular data breaches in the last few years where people's driver's license details and so forth have been leaked. Well, not leaked, sorry, hacked. Leaks suggest they let the information out. But you should have appropriate security in place. In fact, you're required to have that so that that information is kept private. So let's see what we know so far. Which of the following is not required to be included in a privacy policy? So, the kinds of personal information the organisation collects, should that be in the policy? How the organisation collects and holds personal information? The names and contact details of all employees who handle personal information? And whether the organisation is likely to disclose personal information to overseas recipients. So, A, B and D are all things that should be specified. C, no, you don't get to know the name of everybody who's going to have access to it, although I guess some people would like that, but that's not the state of play at the moment. So the correct answer is C, would not be in there. Under APP2, individuals must have the option to deal with organisations anonymously or with a pseudonym where practicable. In which situation would an organisation be legally allowed to require information? When the customer is browsing products in an online store? No, I've seen places do it, but it's not legal. You can't say you must set up an account with us just to see what we sell. When required, by Australian law? Yeah, absolutely. If it's required by law, then you're allowed to do it. C and D, when it would make their life easier or when they have a policy, your company policy doesn't trump law. If the law says you can be anonymous just because you'd like that information, tough. Retail company has collected customer email addresses for processing online orders. Which of the following would be an acceptable use? Selling the email list to a marketing company? No, not without permission or explicit permission for that. Using the emails to send promotional offers without customer consent? Well, it's right there, it's without customer consent, so no. Sharing the emails with the delivery company to fulfill the customer's order? Yeah, that's the correct answer. You'd be allowed to do that. That's a foreseeable and predictable use of that data. And providing the emails to a sister company for their marketing campaign. I would like to say that this is all like really obvious, that you would just say, oh, of course you're not going to do these. I've had recent situations where people have used data collected under one pretext and used it and passed it on to people to do marketing for their product. But like, oh yeah, we're doing some market research about why you should use that product. And then interestingly, they're like, oh, well, the APPs don't apply to us, and they definitely do apply to them. But, it happens. So, which of the following is a requirement under APP 11? Organisations must use military-grade encryption. Organisations must take reasonable steps to protect personal information. Organisations must employ a dedicated cybersecurity team, or organisations must store all personal information in Australia. It's actually B. Now, organisations are allowed to ship your data overseas. They should let you know that they're going to do that, and it has to have the same protections that it would have if it hadn't left Australia, but they can and do store it overseas. But they do need to take reasonable steps no matter where it's stored. And I'm pretty sure this is the final question. A social media platform allows users to create accounts. Which combination of actions would demonstrate compliance? So, I'm basically going to try and rule them out. So, allowing anonymous browsing looks good. Having a clear privacy policy also looks good, and using strong passwords. Okay, so A is my favourite so far. Collecting all possible user data? No. Storing it indefinitely? No. And sharing it freely? I don't even know what that means, but I suspect no. So I like A more than B. Requiring real names only? I wouldn't have thought you'd need that as a social media company. Having no privacy policy? So it's definitely not C. You can't have no privacy policy. Selling user data to advertisers, hiding privacy settings, and never deleting old accounts. So it's A. And that's the end of this presentation. So I hope that was useful to you. And that's the end of it.